Hi, everybody. Welcome back to One Day University. My name is Dr. Tina Rivers Ryan, and I'm a curator at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Gothic architecture. This is actually one of my favorite subjects. I wound up studying modern art, and that's what I do today. I'm a curator of modern and contemporary art. But when I went to college, I intended to major in medieval history. I've always been fascinated with the time period. I used to spend my summers reading medieval literature back when I was in high school. And when we took a family vacation to Europe, I begged my parents to drive me all around so I could visit all of the Gothic cathedrals in out of the way cities that American tourists don't normally visit, like Ulm and Strasbourg. So I'm very excited to give my first presentation on the Gothic for One Day U today. Now, Gothic architecture is the term that we use to describe the predominant architectural style of the Middle Ages in Europe, and particularly the 12th to 14th centuries. We do normally associate it with churches, but that's basically because churches were the most significant builders in this time period. They were the ones who had the resources and who had the need to create these enormous monuments. And you have to imagine seeing a church like this, which is Amiens Cathedral. We'll come back to that in a moment. When, it's the year 1350 and you live in a house that's probably 1 story tall, most of the buildings you see are probably no more than 2 or 3 stories tall. And then you come upon this, perhaps at the end of your pilgrimage, and you can see it for miles from the distance, and it completely towers over the city's landscape and is the automatic sort of icon that everyone in the city orients themselves towards when they're navigating their way around town. So, they're still very impressive, but you also have to imagine how even more impressive they would have looked to somebody in an age before skyscrapers, before airplanes, before, all of the amazing architectural feats that we have now. Now, today, when we use the term Gothic, it can be used to describe the architecture of this particular time period, but it also has a sort of broader meaning, referring to things that are bizarre or fantastic or dramatic. And for example, there's a popular teenage soap culture that has been around at least since I was a teenager and still exists, called goth. And goths are people who are very much into the idea of dark and romantic books and music and clothing and makeup. And this sense of the term goth really derives from the fact that in the 19th century, during the period of Romanticism, there was a revival of interest in the Gothic, and a lot of Gothic buildings at that moment were sort of falling into a state of ruin. And so this romantic idea of the sort of dark and forgotten and dramatic. And so you see that, for example, in this painting on the left by the German romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich of an abbey, an old Gothic abbey that, as you can see here, has sort of fallen apart with the dark trees growing over it. And this is sort of the source of the dark romanticism of German expressionism in the early 20th century, which you might be familiar with thanks to this film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of the early icons of cinema. So the term itself actually originated in the Renaissance period. The term Gothic, people in the Renaissance used this term to describe this moment in architecture that at that point was really only about 200 years old. So Gothic was not what people in the Middle Ages called their architecture. It was coined, a few centuries later by people in the Renaissance. The reason they called this architecture Gothic, they were drawing upon the name of a Germanic tribe, a nomadic tribe, the Goths, including the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who were responsible for invading the Roman Empire and for the fall of the Roman Empire in the 300s. So to the people in the Renaissance, what made the Renaissance in part the Renaissance was this revival of interest in antiquity, and they really idolized classical Greece and Rome. And so to them, the people who brought down the Roman Empire were the enemy. They were barbarians. They were, uncivilized savages who just didn't appreciate the amazing culture of that time period. And so they used Gothic to describe this kind of architecture, which, these Italian Renaissance humanists especially associated with with Northern Europe, with Germany, with France, with sort of the homeland of the Goths, to describe architecture that they saw as being barbaric and uncivilized, because of course the architecture that they thought was beautiful and they put on a pedestal was classical Greek and Roman architecture. So I'm going to briefly walk you through the history. I mean, very briefly walk you through the history of how we got from Greek architecture to Gothic architecture. So in classical Greek architecture, you see buildings that are made using a system called post and lintel, which basically means you were usually laid out in a rectangle, in a symmetrical rectangle, giving us that association of classical art with symmetry and order and balance and rationality. Now, the Romans actually had a different preferred architectural style. Instead of rectangles, they really loved circles. And so you can think of the Colosseum and the Pantheon in Rome as being great examples of their love of circles. Now, the Romans also introduced the arch. They, instead of having those rectangular post and lintels, they love the rounded arch. And when you take a rounded arch and you extend it back in 3 dimensions, you make something called a barrel vault. And so we see lots of rounded arches and barrel vaults. And then they love to cap off these circular structures with a dome. Of course, it sort of demands, if you have a big circle, you have to put a sort of a half circle on top. So they love domes. Now, when the Christians came along, they began modifying the Roman architectural style by sort of expanding it out into a cruciform structure. So obviously the cruciform, symbolic of the crucifix of Jesus. And so they use the symbolism to pioneer an architectural style that basically, looks like a kind of cross. Now, I'm showing you here some early sort of transitional buildings, sort of taking us out of the early Christian period and into the Middle Ages. And you can see here that they added another invention. So when you take a barrel vault, so remember, if you have an arch and then you extend it into space, it becomes a barrel vault. And if you take 2 barrel vaults and cross them over each other, you have something called a groin vault. And so on the left here, you see an example of a barrel vault. And on the right, you see a groin vault where these 2 barrel vaults intersect. And so this is going to be the sort of first sign of the emergence of what will become a true Gothic style. Now, the weight of these vaults is quite heavy, these vaults, and because they're made of stone. So you have to then support these heavy stone vaults with very thick stone walls. And if your walls have to be load bearing, if they're supporting all of that weight of that heavy stone roof, then those walls need to be really solid. You can't cut into them with windows. So the windows of these buildings tend to be very small. So these are all basically the defining features of what we call the Romanesque, meaning, we call it the Romanesque because it's Roman-like. It's kind of like Roman architecture because of the presence of the rounded arch and the barrel vaults. But adding on the crucifix form of the Christian church, and then also the groin vault. So Romanesque in a nutshell, from the 6th to the 12th centuries, rounded arches, barrel vaults and groin vaults, massive thick walls, and small windows because of those thick walls. So the result of all of this is that these buildings feel very heavy. And being inside them, they're very dark. So these are very heavy and dark buildings. Now, as time passed, the builders realized that a pointed arch is actually stronger than a rounded arch. And if you take a pointed arch and extend it into space to make a vault, Instead of being a barrel vault, that's called a rib vault, as you can imagine, because it sort of looks like ribs. And then it gets even crazier after that with something called a fan vault, which is like, late Gothic and just like visually sort of crazy looking. So you see an example on the left of a rib vault in Paris, and then on the right at Cambridge, one of the most famous fan vaults in existence. Now, because the pointed arch is stronger than a rounded arch, you don't need to make your walls quite as massive to help support the whole structure. And of course, I'm not an engineer, so I know that I'm probably being overly reductive in how this all works, but from what I understand, basically a pointed arch means that your walls don't need to be quite so massive, which means your walls can actually start having windows in them. And the evolution of the Gothic, I mean, it's again a little bit reductive to imply that everything was always moving through time in one direction, but generally speaking, they get more and more windows in their walls as the Gothic sort of progresses. So the Gothic is really from the 12th to the 14th century, and again defined by these pointed arches, which are used to make rib vaults, thinner walls, larger windows, and then as a result of these larger windows really having a sense of lightness, both in a metaphorical sense, that the building doesn't look so heavy and solid as the Romanesque, but also literally filled with light thanks to the addition of all of these windows. Now, the truly defining characteristic of Gothic that makes it so special is the invention of the flying buttress. So, essentially, the flying buttress is a way of designing a building to have the weight of the ceiling come down, not just on the interior walls, but to shift that weight off into a sort of second vertical support system. So you can see here in this illustration on the right, the buttress is a sort of wall that's not the wall you see when you're standing inside the church. It's a wall that's outside the church, in a sense, from the immediate interior in the nave. And then a flying buttress will connect the roof over to that upright. And so it's taking the weight and carrying it down sort of to these outside exterior walls. And that means that the interior walls that are immediately alongside the nave of the church can get even thinner and have even more windows. So essentially, it's a kind of exterior scaffolding or an exoskeleton where the structural support of the building is being externalized on the outside. And that's really the defining characteristic of, or the crowning engineering feat, I should say, of Gothic architecture. So again, just to juxtapose these two side by side, the Romanesque, sort of looking back to the tradition of Roman architecture, and then the Gothic, which is really pushing the Romanesque into something quite new and different and pretty stunning, really truly an architecture of light and air. Now, the Gothic was an international style. It was developed in England and France and Germany. But when we teach Gothic architecture at Columbia University, we focus particularly on Amiens Cathedral. And so I'm going to be drawing now on the work of my colleagues, and particularly Professor Emeritus Stephen Murray, who is a true expert in the Cathedral of Amiens, to use Amiens as a kind of case study for you. Of what Gothic architecture is all about. Now, I usually don't like to emphasize a lot of jargon in my presentations for you guys. I try to keep things really accessible, but Gothic architecture is one instance where it really does help to have some of the terminology at your disposal. So I'm just going to briefly introduce some key terms that will come up again throughout my presentation. But don't worry, you don't have to memorize all of these. My undergrads had to do that, but you don't. So the one term you should know is the nave arcade. So this describes the sort of lower level of the elevation of the wall inside of the cathedral. Directly above that is a level that we call the triforium, and I'll explain why it's called that in a few minutes. And then directly above the triforium is the clerestory. And the mnemonic for that is that it's the story that's clear above the rest. So this is where, of course, you'd have all your stained glass windows and your rose windows. So those are some of the key terms that I will keep coming back to throughout this talk. And then if you look over here on the right side of the slide at the plan, a couple key terms for you to know. Right in the middle is what's called the central crossing, because this is where the two axes of the church cross over each other. The horizontal axis you see here is called the transept. And so on either side of the central crossing, these are the transept arms. And then on the vertical axis on either side of the central crossing, you have the choir up here, and then the nave down below here. And essentially all of the major public liturgical ceremonies for the cathedral would happen, in the central crossing. And then there would be a choir screen. And then the space behind here would be sort of more private for the members or for the clergy. Now, Amiens Cathedral in particular, as you see here, was begun in 1220 and finished roughly around 1270, but work definitely continued throughout the later Middle Ages, including up into actually 1527. Now, why did cathedrals take so long to build? I mean, obviously, it's incredibly complicated to build something like this when you don't have machines powered by gas or electricity, when you're basically doing everything with man and animal power. But on top of that, because these projects took so long, inherently because of just the building of them, people's interest would sort of wax and wane. The project might run out of money and then have to wait a generation for more excitement to build up and people to find the desire to, fund the completion of the construction. So as these projects dragged on, sometimes for centuries, new developments in engineering and new architects would come on board who had maybe slightly different plans, maybe different aesthetics. And so these buildings would actually change sort of, as they were growing, they would evolve. And so that's why you see that a lot of cathedrals, including this one at Amiens, are not symmetrical. They don't match. And that's because it wasn't all built at once. And as it was built over time, things evolved. So that's the logistical reason for why it looks like this. But it's very interesting to think about the sort of philosophical implications of that. If you go back to Greek architecture with its perfect symmetry, the Greeks really had this idea about perfection in art being tied to a kind of rationality, that there is a plan that is executed, and it's a kind of perfect a priori object, right? That the Parthenon is a perfect rectangle. The Parthenon wouldn't really make sense if it wasn't, symmetrical and perfect in that way. But those values are not at play in the Middle Ages. Their idea of perfection is not tied to symmetry or a rational geometric a priori form. So it's just a very different idea, a very different value system that's at play. Now, obviously, the cathedral exists to be a space for the church to conduct its business, but also it was a tourist destination. And one reason in particular that people would go to a cathedral was to see relics. So every cathedral had to have its own important relic to draw pilgrims who would travel, for miles and for days and days, sometimes weeks, to visit the cathedral. And the cathedrals even sold souvenir booklets and things like that. So, really, it's sort of the birth in a way of the international tourist trade, with people traveling across Europe to go see these things. So at Amiens, the relic is actually the head of St. John the Baptist, which was brought back in 1204 from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. So I just want to mention that because, these cathedrals are really, in a way, they're kind of like destinations for long distance travel. And you have to imagine, again, seeing this cathedral, from miles away on the horizon, and then finally getting up close to it. And then when you move into the cathedral, because it is so elongated along that access of the choir and the nave, you have these long aisles that invite you to continue your journey, through the church and then sort of circle you back. So it's important to note that churches are aligned according to an east-west axis. So I just want to point out that the altar that you see over here on the right side of the screen is always aligned to the east, and then the sort of front doors of the cathedral, the portals, are always at the west. And this is for two reasons. First of all, symbolically, the sun is rising over the altar. And then also, when you are traveling through the church like this, following, you enter and follow these aisles from the west to the east, you are, moving towards God, you are moving towards the altarpiece, you're moving towards the most holy part of the church, and you are moving towards the light. So there's a lot of symbolism that's built into this. Now, the architects at Amiens were particularly brilliant. The building is not perfectly rational. It does have irregularities, but these irregularities result not only from changes in engineering and taste over time, they also were planned very deliberately. So if you look at this plan of the building, you can see that all of the bays of the nave are not the same size. So you can see that the two that I've highlighted in red here are actually wider than the other ones in between them. And the reason for this is it's controlling your experience of space. So imagine you walk into this cathedral through the portal. You would enter through the left door, actually, if you were just a regular person. You walk in and you're in this space that feels sort of quite wide. And then visually, each of these bays, the immediate bay right after that is smaller and it contracts. And so it's acting like a kind of funnel where you're in this wide space, and then you're going to enter into this space that's more narrow, and then you're going to continue traveling through these narrow, relatively sort of short spaces. And then the space widens again, gets bigger again, right before you hit the central crossing. So it's almost like a tube with a funnel at either end, funneling you in, and then you travel through, and then it funnels you out again right into the central crossing. So truly amazing that they were able to understand not only how to build these things, but that they thought very deliberately about how you experience space and how they could sort of pull you into space and create an experience for you that was like a journey and then ended in a kind of revelation or discovery and expansiveness. If you look at this plan again, right around the central crossing, you'll see that actually all four of the bays that are immediately open onto the central crossing are in fact bigger than all of the other ones immediately next to them. So again, it's, from all directions, it's emphasizing that central crossing as being sort of the heart of the church. The architects at Amiens understood how to manage your experience of space, not only as you moved sort of through the cathedral along the floor, but also vertically, thinking about how you experience the space of the cathedral as you look up. So you'll notice that there is a very prominent band sort of in the middle of each wall along the nave. So remember, the lower level is the nave arcade, and then above that is the triforium, and then above that is the clerestory. And you'll see here that the triforium, you can see it a little more clearly now, is called that because there are usually, a division. There's columns that divide under each arch the space into 3 units. So here you have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 repetitions of these sort of gaps of 3 all along the triforium. So so notice how the overall height of this is divided not into 3 equal levels, but actually the nave gets about 50%. Actually, it's exactly 50%. The overall height is 42 meters tall, and the nave arcade is 21 meters tall. So what they're doing here is they're allowing you to really experience. They're keeping the height, that unbroken height, down at the bottom where you can really experience it and feel it. And so I'll give you some comparisons to explain what I mean by that. So here are 4 different elevations of 4 different churches. And you can see how Amiens is only about 25% taller than Notre Dame in Paris. And yet it feels so much taller, because look how much more of the height of Amiens is given to the nave arcade instead of to the clerestory and the triforium, right? That height is down at the bottom where you can really feel it, and it's unbroken, going all the way up. Now, the emphasis on verticality also, comes through in the use of line. So you'll notice that, along the nave arcade, you have these pointed arches. And of course, the arches, because they're pointed and they're quite narrow, they all sort of point upwards like giant arrow signs. But then directly above that pointed arch, you'll see a mullion. So there's it's a part of the structure that's dividing the sort of screen of the triforium, and there's like a very thick, it almost looks like a column that's thicker than the ones on either side of it. So that pointed arch feeds your vision right into that thick column, and notice how that thick column is actually covered in tiny little columns. And then from there, your vision shoots straight up again into another mullion that separates, the 2 halves of the stained glass windows above that. So basically this whole thing, it's like an arrow that just shoots your vision, and then your vision is like, it's like a runway, and it just shoots right up that runway all the way up to the rose window, right under the roof. So there's a big upward visual thrust. And you have to think about the symbolism of this, because of course, the church wants to remind you of God up in the heavens. And so that's part of why the buildings themselves are so tall, is to, they're trying to reach up into the heavens, and to sort of bring your mind off of this plane down here, the horizontal plane of your daily existence, and bring you up into sort of more spiritual realm up in the heaven. Now, when you look up, when your eye continues looking up in the cathedral, ultimately your vision will be capped by the rib vaults up in the ceiling. And these rib vaults are made of very thin, small stone bricks, only about 8 inches long. And those individual bricks, they're sort of lightweight, so it's very easy to build with them. And they're fit together very, very closely. So you see there's not a lot of mortar, separating them. So it creates a nice unified surface, very smooth, very beautiful. And ironically, you look up at it and you're sort of like, well, how did they lift all of that into place? But they didn't lift it into place at all. It was actually lowered into place. So here's a more recent drawing showing you that basically they would build this kind of wood scaffolding and then lower the stones from above the ceiling down onto it. Now, the weight of this roof, again, it's not so much going down into those walls that are filled with stained glass windows as it is going out into the flying buttress. And so here are just 2 photos of the flying buttresses at Amiens, and you can see that they're very different in style. And this is partly because they are from sort of different generations of building. You can see they even can get decorated themselves with little arches. But just to contrast this kind of building with the post and lintel structure at the Parthenon, right? So the Parthenon, just being an example of Greek architecture, as I mentioned before, it's very clear how it's working from a functional perspective, from an engineering perspective. The columns are, bearing the weight of the lintel across it. Whereas in Amiens, you look up and what do you see? You see this canopy of stone that appears to be floating on top of a circle of glass. which doesn't make any sense, right? It seems like that canopy of stone, even though it does itself seem sort of like buoyant somehow because it's so smooth and light colored. You would have to imagine it should be crushing down and breaking all of that glass. But again, it's the flying buttress that takes that weight and sort of shifts it off to the side, that allows for the illusion when you're standing inside of this stone just sort of floating above the glass. And just imagine being a peasant, looking up at this, somebody with no understanding of mathematics or geometry or physics, really beyond your own lived experience. In a way, I mean, it would just make no sense. I mean, it would seem truly magical. It would seem like the building was only standing by the grace of God. And that's exactly the point, right? That's exactly the message that they're trying to communicate here, is to make you aware in a very visceral way of the grace and the miraculousness and the power of God. The church design itself also is very symbolic in terms of reminding you of Christianity and its principles. So the overall building, as I mentioned, is cruciform structure. So it's shaped like a cross. It also, particularly at Amiens, you can see how it's also kind of shaped like a boat. And so this refers back to Noah's Ark, and also the idea of, all Christianity being sort of on a boat together. We're all in this together, that kind of idea. There is also a lot of number symbolism in a Gothic cathedral, and especially at Amiens. So we know, as I mentioned before in other talks, the numbers 3 and 4 are very significant in the Bible, and show up particularly in a passage from the Revelation of St. John the Divine that describes the city of God, where basically an angel reveals to St. John the city of God, and he describes it as a square. And a square that is, it's not just a square, actually, it's a cube measuring 12,000 furlongs. So, again, this 3, 4, and 12 keep showing up. So this is just a quick animation to show you that at Amiens, the central crossing is itself a square, just like the city of God, and that the height of the church is determined by taking the central crossing and essentially rotating it upwards in space. So that's to say that, it's the cube, it's the city of God again, that sort of square cube at the heart of the church in the central crossing. And again, it's, all based on numbers that come from the Bible. In this case, the measurements are 50 by 50, which is supposedly also the measurements of Noah's Ark is 50 cubits. Now, I was just talking about the symbolism of the building overall in terms of its plan, but there's also a lot of symbolism in the sculpture. And so I'm just going to wrap up here by walking you through some of the sculpture that you see, especially as you see along the western facade. So I will just mention, before we zoom in, that when you look at this entire facade, you'll see it's completely covered in sculpture from floor to ceiling, and it's incredibly overwhelming. And again, this is part of the sort of theological function of the church, is to overwhelm you with this incredibly grandiose vision, right? This incredible saturation of images. And I want to mention that while now the individual sculptures might be quite hard to sort of see or pick out, originally they would have been painted in polychromy. So they would have been painted in many different colors, just like actually ancient Greek sculpture was also painted in many different colors, including the Parthenon. And so what they've done now is Amiens at night, they sometimes project the colors onto the stone, so you could get a better sense of what it actually would have looked like back, in its own time. And you can see why a very famous, much later English artist, John Ruskin, referred to Gothic cathedrals as a sermon in stone, right? That there's so much information here being conveyed to you. And you can see that the colors actually make it look almost like stained glass. And of course, the sort of, truism about stained glass, and it's not quite this simple, but basically that stained glass was used to teach the stories of the Bible to a population that couldn't read, that would not have access themselves to those stories, to be able to read in Latin. Now, the sculpture itself, it is all built of the same material as the church. The figures are larger than life. And you can sort of see that here with the group of tourists down below. So as I, always harp on, scale is very important to understanding art. And so these figures are literally larger than life, meaning that they are monumental, that they seem more significant than us, that we have to look up at them with everything that connotes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you would have entered through the left portal. The central portal really would have been reserved for like very important people like the bishop. But essentially there are 3 doors, and each of these has its own sculptural program, its own themes. And so I'm just going to walk through those very quickly. So before we even go into the portals, we are confronted with 12 bodies. There's sort of 4 groups of 3, again, 3, 4, 12, that immediately face us. And these are the 12 minor prophets who prophesied the incarnation of Christ and the establishment of the church. So essentially, as you move through space, you're not just moving through space, you're also moving through time. Because the story begins with the people who prophesied that the church would come. And then, of course, you move more closely in to discover Christ and the church. So in the center portal, at the very center of that, is Christ himself. But before you get to Christ, first you encounter the 4 great prophets, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, 2 on each side. There's a kind of symmetry. And then you encounter the 12 apostles, 6 on each side, and then finally Christ in the middle. So it may seem very chaotic, but there is a kind of order here. There is a kind of hierarchy. And we can see that symbolically we are transitioning from the age of prophecy into the age of grace, right? Getting, from the very old prophets to the 4 great prophets to the apostles in Christ, right? We're sort of transitioning into the key part of the story. Now, you may notice that the apostles and the prophets, they all look a lot like Christ, very sort of similar in their physiology. And that's because, we know that basically they're made in the model of Christ. And so that's taken literally here. Now, beneath them, beneath all of the figures in the portal, we have these quatrefoils that show the labors of the months, the signs of the zodiac, and also the virtues and the vices. And so I'm going to just zoom in really quick on the virtues and the vices. So you can imagine, so the virtues and the vices are in the central portal on either side of Jesus. And you can imagine that these are, if they're on 2 levels, the virtues are on the top level and the vices are on the bottom. And that's because the virtues for us are harder to reach. They're harder to attain. And so literally the vices are down below, sort of at eye level where we can see them, and the virtues are like a little bit higher. So we have to reach up to them. The virtues are also a little bit more abstract because virtue is more hard to imagine, whereas vice is very easy to understand. So just some details. So for example, on the left, this pairing, the image down below shows an amorous couple. So this is representing on the lower left, this is lust. And then above that, the woman by herself pining over this peacock on a crest. This is chastity. This is a sort of symbolic representation of chastity. And then on the right, on the lower right, we see avarice. So this is somebody who is storing money bags away in a chest. Greed. And then above this is actually one of the more literal representations of a virtue. This is a woman who is giving clothing away to a beggar. So this is charity. Some of my favorites are here. So on the left side, we have the pairing of courage and cowardice. So, the knight with his sword, and then below him, the knight who has taken his sword out of his scabbard, but you see it floating in space, because he's tossed it away and he's going, oh no. So that's cowardice. And on the right, we have gentleness above, the woman holding the shield with the lamb on it, gentle like a lamb. And then below that, the 2 people who are fighting. So that's violence. Now, directly above the center figure of Christ in the center portal is another figure of Christ. And, we have to realize that in Gothic art, it it's fine to show the same figure repeated again. It's almost like a comic book where you can have the same figure appearing in different squares on the same page because it's different moments of a story. That's basically the logic of an illuminated manuscript or a sculpture on a cathedral. And so this triangular area above the central portal is called the tympanum. And in there we see Christ in the center. Christ is holding up his hands and we can actually see the stigmata. So we know that this is Christ after he's been resurrected. And this is actually Christ sitting in judgment. And on either side of him are Mary and John the Evangelist, and they are holding their hands up in prayer to Christ because they are praying to him. They're sort of imploring him, beseeching him. And they're doing that because we have asked them to intercede on our behalf, because us sinners here on earth have, asked them, could you please tell Christ to offer me redemption and forgiveness? So this is really a last judgment scene where Christ is sitting here and he is holding up his hands. He's going to sit in judgment. And below him, actually, we see in the horizontal line of people, all of the people on the left who are clothed are marching off to heaven. And then all of the people on the right who are naked are the damned, and they are marching off to hell. On the right portal, this is the portal of Mary. And so we see Mary in the center of this portal. And you have to understand that Mary is really considered kind of like the church incarnate. She is the physical embodiment of the church. And so she plays a very important role. Again, she appears here multiple times. So we see her on the very top here in this red square. She's seated, she's up in heaven, and Jesus is to her side. Notice that she's bigger than Jesus. That's because this is her portal. She's the more important person in the story right now. So she's up there seated, enthroned in heaven. Below this is a scene where we see the dormition and the assumption of Mary. So when Mary, according to the church, she never really dies. She just sort of goes to sleep and then she gets resurrected. So we see her laying down in bed here in these two scenes. And then below that is the Mary in the central portal holding the baby Jesus. So again, it's a kind of narrative that's being told from the bottom, Mary with the newborn Jesus, all the way up, through Mary's death or, dormition and assumption. And then at the very top with her, son up in heaven, full grown. There is another very famous Mary at Amiens Cathedral. I'm just going to point her out briefly, who is not in the portal, but on the south side of the cathedral, that's known as the Golden Virgin. Originally, she was not covered in gold. Then she was actually covered in gold. Now she's been cleaned. And what we see is actually the stone itself, because of the lasers that were used to clean the dirt off, ended up, it's actually chalk and it kind of turned buttery yellow. But this is a very famous image of the Virgin Mary because it is so naturalistic, and we see her kind of smiling, and we see the baby Jesus looking up at her. And if you compare the two images, you can see, why, for example, people in the Renaissance were really drawn more to this image on the right, which seems more lifelike. Now the left portal is really devoted to the sort of local bishops, and so we see a kind of balance here between the symbolism of Mary being the universal church. Sorry, on your side, this is the right side. So the symbolism of Mary being the universal church, and then on the left side, the specific church, the local church, right? So the universal becomes the specific. And of course, you enter on the left where you see a lot of references to sort of local people and traditions. Now, the right and the left sides are linked, of course, by this unending snaking band of the elect, right? The prophets and the saints. And so visually, the whole church is literally built on it. The whole church rests on the bodies of the prophets and the saints. And so, and they are your entry point into this grand story. And just to say that, if you can imagine literally walking under these figures and looking up at them as you enter into this church, it's truly an incredible experience. So here are, some figures On the left side of the left portal, so this is where we, the regular folk, would have entered into the church. They are showing two decapitated martyrs. So you can see there's two guys here who are holding their heads. And just imagine the experience, of walking under them. They're looking sort of down at us or across us over at the other figures. There are these additional little figures on the bottom under the architecture on which they stand. They might remind you of gargoyle figures, for example. And so you can just imagine all of these people surrounding you as you come into this church. So again, that idea of the church as a community and you being invited, you being one of the privileged to be able to enter into this space and join that community too. Just, to summarize, the whole entire Gothic cathedral, from the sort of floor plan and layout to the way that it creates space, to the way that it creates height, to the emphasis on light, to the sculptural program. All of this is really about telling you the story of the Christian church, making you sort of overwhelmed by that history and by that power of God that stands behind all of it, and then also inviting you to be a part of it. Now, the architectural legacy of Gothic, I just want to end by touching on this very quickly. It sort of goes in two directions. So on the one hand, we can think of Gothic architecture as being fundamentally an architecture about light. And there is a story that can be told about architecture after the Gothic that really emphasized light and was really about increasingly using sophisticated forms of technology to create engineering feats to increase the amount of light in a building while still, structurally standing. So the Crystal Palace in London, it's not necessarily Gothic per se, but it was the most light-filled building that had ever been built. This is for the World's Fair in London in 1851. And so this is an example of that kind of legacy of the Gothic church. Now, another legacy of the Gothic church is that it's more about height than light. I mean, of course, it's actually about both. But another legacy would be about height. And so you see the Woolworth building here in New York, which was built in 1913, and at that point became, I believe, the tallest building in the world. It borrowed from the style of Gothic architecture because it was trying to claim to be, just like Gothic architecture in its time, they were the tallest buildings. Now the Woolworth building is going to be the new generation of Gothic. It's going to be the new tallest buildings in the world. And so this idea, of height is more about a kind of symbolism. For the medieval period, the height was a way of accessing God and getting closer to God. And of course, for Woolworth, head of Woolworth's Fives and Dimes, it wasn't necessarily about getting closer to God. It was just about proving their wealth and their power, just the superiority of, it's sort of this capitalist idea that they've somehow won the game. They've risen to the top, right? That they have all of this money and they can build this giant monument to the company. And then finally, I just want to point out, as long as we're talking about New York, this sort of enduring appeal of Gothic. A sort of generation before the Woolworth building, the most famous Gothic icon next to the Woolworth building in New York City is probably the Brooklyn Bridge. And so you can see here that the Brooklyn Bridge, the two towers of the Brooklyn Bridge have the two pointed arches from Gothic architecture. And, it's an interesting question. Why would modern, a very self-consciously modern building project that was, making the longest suspension bridge in the world, that was built in America, in the New World, look back to, and that also is a secular building project, that was, made by a U.S. government that is secular. Why would it look back to the religious architecture of Europe from 500 years earlier? And I think it has to do with that legacy of Gothic, that we always associate Gothic with both feats of engineering, the Brooklyn Bridge being a total feat of engineering in its day, and also with that sense of height, with that the symbolism of striving for the heavens, striving for more, pointing our eye upwards with those arches and thinking about the possibilities up in the sky. So I'm going to end there. Thank you guys so much for listening. And now I look forward to taking your questions in just a moment. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of the wonderful questions that have been pouring in. I want to explain that right now there is a very big storm in my region and it's knocked out a lot of power locally. And I think it's also upsetting the internet. So if I am coming across to you and there's a big problem with the video, it's not your computer, it's mine. And I apologize for that. I will probably keep my answers brief so you guys don't have to suffer through too much of the video lag. The first question that came in was about the roof of Notre Dame de Paris, which of course burned down 3 years ago, unfortunately, and whether or not it should have been rebuilt with the same oak wood as the original, or whether it should have been built with a more resilient modern material like titanium. This is an excellent question, and I want to preface my answer by saying that I am far from an architect. So if you're looking for an answer that would take into account engineering, I can't really provide that. All I can say is that the idea that the church must be rebuilt exactly as it was before speaks to our values as a society more than anything else. So I mentioned before, the difference between how people in the Middle Ages and during the Gothic period might have understood a work of art and what it meant for it to be perfect. And I compared it to in classical Greek architecture, their notion of perfection. So our notion of perfection now is in some ways indebted to the classical tradition. We believe in a kind of unity or purity of the object, that Notre Dame really wouldn't be itself if parts of it were exchanged or replaced. And so therefore we need to return it back to its original state. I just want to point out that this is a very, very complicated fiction. Notre Dame hasn't been in its original state basically ever. Like many cathedrals, as I explained, it evolved over time. It's not like it was finished very quickly. It actually developed over hundreds of years, and the plans for it evolved during that period. In the 19th century, there was a very famous Frenchman named Viollet-le-Duc, who was responsible for sort of reviving interest in these Gothic cathedrals, and he oversaw the restoration of many of them, including Amiens and Notre Dame in Paris. And we know that, in fact, he made a lot of edits to those cathedrals, that he, either because of his own ideas about beauty or because of lack of information, he did not restore them to some pure original state. So in other words, the Notre Dame that existed before the fire was not even any kind of original Notre Dame. I don't even know what it would mean to sort of refer to an original. Which year in particular are you going to try to pinpoint as being the original when it's something that was worked on for so long? So again, just to say, I don't have an answer from an engineer's perspective about what would be safest, but I do think it's interesting that we as a culture are valuing this idea of the sort of original cathedral and the idea that we have to return to the original cathedral, when in fact the very idea of the original here is really complicated. Okay, other questions that came in were about the people who made these cathedrals. So a couple of you asked about that. So in the Middle Ages, there was no term for architect, really. There weren't architects the way that we recognize that profession now. There were master masons. And it's essentially the masons who would have been in charge of overseeing the construction of these buildings. And these masons would have been members of guilds, and there would have been many guilds involved in the construction of a cathedral. There would have been a stone cutters guild. There would have been a guild for the people working on the sculptures on the facades. And originally, our word masterpiece, it derives from the way in which somebody would gain entrance into these guilds. So if you were a young apprentice, there was no art school back then. You would learn your trade, and it was very much a trade. It was a craft. It was not an elevated thing that you went to university to study. It was a trade that you did with your hands, and you would learn that by apprenticing in a workshop. And when you were ready to sort of graduate and become your own master and not an apprentice, you would submit a piece to the guild to be judged, and this was your masterpiece. And the masterpiece was not an authentic, original work of art, not something that was groundbreaking and unlike anything had been done before. Your masterpiece was supposed to be a perfect copy of the thing that the guild was very famous for doing. So, for example, for the painters guilds, a certain guild might specialize in a very particular kind of a painting of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. And so your masterpiece was you perfectly copying that painting. And that would admit you into the guild. And now you could be one of these guild members who could take commissions and make more altarpieces of that exact same image. So it's a bit of a digression, but just to explain, I always think it's interesting to think of the origin of the term masterpiece and how its meaning has changed 180 degrees essentially since that, 1,000 years ago. So there were people who were highly skilled artisans who were members of guilds who worked on these buildings. And if you think about the construction period, like the original construction period for Amiens was from 1220 to 1270. That's a 50-year window. That means that you spend your entire life working on that building. And not only that, but actually your kids may inherit that job, and your son might also go and spend his entire life carving the front of that church. So these, it's just a very different idea about working and about the relationship to a job that an artist might have today, where we think that an artist is somebody who is, working independently, in their studio, making art of their own will, and then, maybe sometimes trying to find a buyer. These are people who essentially, were engaged on this one building project for their entire lives. There was another question about how many people might have died during the building of these cathedrals. Unfortunately, there were certainly some that we know about from historical records that are kept by the church. So, there was another question about how do we know people's thoughts as they were building and designing these churches. So remember, these churches are, they're all still functioning churches today still. A cathedral is usually in a city that is the site of the bishop of the region, ex cathedra. That's the origin of the term. That's the city where the bishop's chair literally sits. So these are all, really significant cities within the Catholic Church. And these churches have been continuously operating, obviously, for, ever since they were built. So all of the records are maintained, unless, they were destroyed by the French revolutionaries or lost in a fire or something like that. But, many of the records remain. And so we do have records of, how much was paid, for a certain salary, or, we have some of the original designs or drawings. So yes, we do have original records to draw on. I'm just looking at the questions now and seeing how much time I have left. How much can I try to answer? I think I've answered most of your questions. There's one question about St. Peter's in Rome and in England. So Renaissance structures. Another question about the color, whether it would simply deteriorate over time, or were there intentional efforts to remove the color in later periods? I wish I knew a more detailed answer for you. My understanding is that the color largely just deteriorated over time because obviously the paint is exposed to the elements. And then after the Renaissance period, there was a kind of fetishization of white sculpture because they fetishized all of these antique sculptures that were then being unearthed out of the ground because of the reborn interest in the ancient world. And so they were excavating these sculptures. And of course, these sculptures had their paint, originally they would have been painted, but the sculptures had their paint worn off while they were buried underground, except for some, traces. So there was this mistaken idea that the ancients also made white marble sculpture. And so in the Renaissance and afterwards, white marble sculpture became the standard norm. And so I would think that after the Renaissance, there was really no motive to restore the facades of these Gothic churches. Already the people in the Renaissance thought that they were barbaric, and to add color to them would have made them look even more barbaric or old-fashioned. So essentially, that's why they've remained so ever since. I'm not sure if there were any deliberate attempts to remove the color. I know that there were definitely deliberate attempts to deface many of these churches. The most significant cathedrals escaped much of the damage, but with the French revolutionaries, they were not only Republican, they were also anti-clerical. And so they, even invented their own calendar so that they could stop using a calendar that was tied to the birth of Jesus. So there was a lot of defacing of public Catholic monuments. It was an iconoclastic movement similar to, what Al-Qaeda, for example, has been doing. So it's possible that there was some deliberate, but I'm just not entirely sure about the color in particular. All right, I think I have actually run out of time for more questions, but hopefully that answers most of your questions. And I just am being reminded to very briefly mention that this weekend, you will receive an email on Sunday called The Weekend Scholar, and in that you will find a link to a new 20-minute primer that I have recorded on crypto art. So if any of you have been hearing the news about these new things called NFTs and using the blockchain to sell works of digital art, I recorded a short introduction to that, and it's very, very different from Gothic art. But if you are still interested in learning more about art this weekend, look out for that on Sunday. So as always, thank you guys so much for your attention and for your wonderful questions, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great weekend.